I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside, it's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, "No, no, 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 we're going to do this." And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show. Today on the James Altucher Show.
All my favorite topics combined in one podcast with Angela Duckworth. We're going to talk, how do you find your passion? How do you get persistent? How do you learn fast? What's the deal with the 10,000 hour rule? And why do I now believe in the 10,000 experiment rule? And a lot more. So listen to the continuation of my conversation with Angela Duckworth, author of Grit. What does he think? What does he think is going on?
He thinks you're right in the short term, but that you may not be right in the medium and long term. He said in the short term, yeah, cities are going to have huge problems and there's going to be exodus. But he said the fundamental nature of cities is that they are they're labor markets, and that people tend to be more productive and more creative when they're together than when they're just like all over the place. So he does not think that the future of the world and like the economy and the way we work is going to be that like everybody's in their kitchen like wearing pajamas.
I 100% agree with him, which is that, if you look at every great art movement, every great literary movement, even every great tech movement, they all started in cities. And so ideas combine and people network and all sorts of magical things happen in a city. And I guess when I think about it, the short term is where I get worried that there's no solutions.
Yeah.
And if I can't think of like solutions, then what happens next?
I know. It's like, how do you get from the short term to the medium term, right? Like if that's the short term, then what happens?
Yeah. Like in the article you sent me, I point out, the guy said, well, in 10 years, it should get better. What happens magically in those 10 years? Like 10 years feels like a long time. Like you might have 1 million people unemployed in next year in New York City, and who's going to trust it again? Like it could be the case that cities that once were no longer are. And so the next big city becomes Nashville or, God forbid, Philadelphia or something like that.
Hey, we're due for a comeback. It's been about like 400 years. Since
Philadelphia is a great example of the city that once was.
Yeah, but America likes nothing more than a comeback. But I think your point is right. Maybe remember that scene in Sleeping Beauty when the three fairies know that like it's going to be 100 years before the princess is going to wake up. So they put them all to sleep. Do you not remember this?
I don't remember. Was that like in the real life?
They sprinkle magic fairy dust on the whole town, and like everyone just falls asleep for 100 years.
Was it the Disney version or was it
That was a
the
Disney version. That
Oh,
was
I
not
didn't
like the
remember that.
original, like,
Right, the Grimm's
Grimm's
brother
fairy
version.
tale. Yeah, probably in the Grimm's
Wow,
fairy
I don't
tale,
remember
everybody goes
that.
into a coma.
I didn't
or
remember that too.
I always kind of wished something like that would happen, particularly when I was more of a stock market investor. It's like, okay, I know these companies are good, but I can't stand waiting and the daily ups and downs. Just put me to sleep for a year and
And then wake you
hopefully
up.
they'll be up when I wake up. Of course,
Yeah,
none
I
of those
like
stocks
that.
were up a year later, but that's okay.
Is that how you self-identify as an investor?
No, I did like in maybe 2000 or 2004, but now more writer, podcaster, maybe entrepreneur, maybe
And
stand-up comedian.
yeah, stand-up comedian.
Oh,
Performing
stand-up
tonight.
comedian. Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay.
Yeah, and I don't know. I just posted again about solutions for cities, and just everybody just trashes me everywhere every time I do this.
What did you
But
post?
I posted this idea that maybe you can create a negative sales tax. So this reduces the addiction to Amazon. So if you have a negative sales tax, if I buy local, then I get some sort of credits or something that could be only redeemed locally, or I can wait 10 years and I can redeem them in dollars. So there's as much incentive as possible to do as many transactions locally to get this negative sales tax, which is first in the form of, credits you could use as currency only locally, and then only 10 years later, you can convert them into dollars. So there's incentive for people to come to the city and transact. There's incentive for people to, who live in the city to buy in the city. There's incentive for businesses to start up again because everybody else has these incentives to use your store and so on.
This is like the opposite of the euro, right? It's like you want to go to like local currency away from kind of like frictionless transactions wherever you are.
Yeah.
Boundaryless.
Yeah, it's interesting because globalism was such a huge trend for the world and still is for the world in general. But at the moment, local economies are having incredible problems. So if you went totally globalist with, Amazon is your one-stop shop for everything, and you never have to think of your local community, I think we all got a lot more aware of how important, let's say, local politics and local decision making was this year. I've never thought about who. I barely
You're
even
like
knew who the
state
mayor of New York
senator.
was. Yeah, like who's your state senator? Nobody knows. Who's your city council person? But that's become an issue now because if your store is closed and you're about to go out of business and there's vandalism and this and that, you go to your city council person. You have to find out who that is. And
Yeah.
I think local in general has become more important, but also more in trouble than anything else.
Yeah, I just worry, like, if there's no precedent for that globally, which I don't know that there is, it just makes me wonder whether there's some reason why it's not viable. I don't know. If it does feel like building a sandcastle and like trying to make a really great wall, but the ocean's going to come in, right? Like,
Yeah.
And then, there's water everywhere.
Well, here's another interesting issue. Like, let's say climate change, let's say just getting past all the arguments about the science. Let's just say we want a better climate, all the things people are worried about. Who cares? Let's just make them better, regardless of what they are. There's two ways to do it. One is to stop everything that's causing a bad climate, or to do nothing and assume that technological trends will continue, like solar power will, quadruple in efficiency every 2 years, and nuclear fusion will get cleaner and cleaner and faster. Lithium ion batteries will continue to generate double the mileage every 2 years. All these sort of Moore's law industries will happen, and just naturally climate change will end. There'll be no more carbon emissions because just technology evolves instead of spending $60 trillion on a Green New Deal. And so it's just one of those things. There's no precedent for it, but there is precedent that technology evolves, and technologies are the water, and you can't dam them with policy is the point.
Wait, but are you arguing for like a passive kind of like, let's just let the laissez-faire, like let's let the forces like take care of it? You're not, right? I think you're arguing the opposite.
Well, no, I'm saying in general that's not a good argument, but in this case it probably is, because all the technologies that are, or not all of them, but some of the renewable energy technologies that are exponentially increasing are the exact ones
You would want.
you would want to be big industries to solve the carbon emissions problem. And so for people without grit, say, for people with like kind of a fixed
Short-term
mindset
horizon.
of, or maybe a scarcity mindset of
Yeah.
what happens in the world, they want to say, okay, no, we need to spend $60 trillion because that's what it's going to cost to develop solar power and shut down the oil drilling and all these things. Or you could do nothing, but we know these technologies are happening. I have an abundance mindset that solar power and wind and batteries are going to continue to double every so often, and that will naturally solve things without spending an additional dime, and it'll create whole new industries at the same time.
Interesting. Well, I would definitely not be the social scientist to weigh in on such questions because it's not my training. And it's actually just it's like I can only understand it in like the most abstract terms. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good question, James. So I'll refrain from saying anything.
And to your point, look at election night. Everybody I knew, they were like single-handedly manning a campaign. Like people were calling each other up, like, here's the latest data I have. It was like there were a combination newsroom political campaign in every single
Yeah,
house.
everybody individually.
Yeah, everybody's texting and talking to each other. Well, oh, this county in Pennsylvania hasn't
Alameda
counted all the
doing?
votes yet, but it should
Yeah.
be blue. And, to your point, not everybody should be an expert. Some people should just relax and maybe
Be in
watch
the
a movie.
audience?
Yeah, be the audience. Not everybody needs to be.
You didn't do that?
No, I did it as well, and I was wrong about everything.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, look, here's a psychological perspective on the election. Like, in addition to everything else that's going on, there are so few occasions in contemporary American life where we have what psychologists would call joint attention, which, like, I'm looking at the same thing that you're looking at the exact same time. It's actually how infants learn how to speak, right? Like how they acquire language. In part, it's that like your mommy looks at a cup and you look at the cup, and the mommy points at the cup, and you're looking at the cup and she's looking at the cup, and the mommy says, "Cup, see the cup?" Right? So moments of joint attention are rare because like we live in this, asynchronous world. Like I watched this TED Talk, but I watched it at a different time that you watched it. And I streamed The Office last night at 10, but you saw this episode 4 years ago. And I do think that actually the joint attention that happened on election night and the night before the election and the night after the election, and like it's still going on. I don't know, in some ways it's kind of, I know we're a divided nation, but at least we are all looking at the same thing. I think that's kind of, remember when people used to watch the Charlie Brown like Halloween special, and because it only aired at like 8 p.m. Eastern time on the network that like carried it, and it was like everybody watched it at the same time. I think we lose something when we don't do anything at the same time anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, remember, like when we were kids, to your point about Charlie Brown, it's like every Tuesday, all my friends would watch Happy Days and Laverne and
Yes.
Shirley. And then you
Right,
get on
back
the
to
bus
back.
and like, can't believe what the Fonz did yesterday. And now that never happens. It
never
happens a little
happens.
bit. Like we're all roughly watching the Netflix series Queen's Gambit, or we all roughly watched,
Game of
Tiger
Thrones.
King at the same time. But what do you think it does to society when we lose those kind of when we
Shared
lose the kind of
moments.
coherence? Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that there's a negative side of like everybody just being on their own schedule, right? I also don't have a solution for this, right? Like it's very hard to go back, like it's very hard to like put Charlie Brown's Halloween special in the vault and only air it at this one time. And it's never going to happen. But I think it's one of the things that brings a lot of joy, right? They're like, what did the Fonz do? Like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe Linus was. Every time I see that, like there is something about all of us doing our own thing in every way, right? Like now we have like infinite personalization, right? Like I'm gonna order my pizza this way, and I'm gonna like watch this on Netflix. So there's obviously an upside to that, but there is a downside. I think I don't want to say that this is why our society is so fragmented, but it certainly doesn't contribute to a sense of community.
Right. Although I guess we become more diverse in the knowledge we have, and that diversity could mingle with each other to create newer or more original ideas.
Yeah, I think that's one of the upsides, right? You're like, oh, and also people can find their niche. Like,
Yeah.
You happen to want to hang out with the people who are like really into like this kind of Sudoku puzzle, and like, you find this like micro community. So it's not horrible, but like what do you lose when everyone is local, right? I don't know if you read Bowling Alone And this
No.
kind of stretches. Have you heard of Bowling Alone?
Yeah, I've heard of it. I've never read it.
It's this like sociological perspective. So bowling, I mean, it's now published years ago. I mean, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. But it made the comment that, Americans used to bowl in leagues, right? In teams. And it was actually at one point like the number one thing that families did was like be on a bowling team. Like you see it in like 1950s movies and you have your own bowling ball with your like name on it. And then there was a trend from leagues to bowling alone. And people would just, they no longer were in part of a group. And there were all these other trends that you could track over decades that collectively suggested that we're kind of like living lives that are just separate and uncoordinated from each other. Like the opposite of living in a village where like everyone's interdependent and you always bake your bread at the town oven because there's only one oven. Like everybody sees each other there and you're all more or less eating the same kind of bread. And so it's a historical trend probably that goes way back. And like you said, there's like upsides to that. And maybe it's also inevitable. But there is something like I walk around my block and I realize like I literally know, except for one person, nobody on my block. And I probably will never know anybody on my block. I have no idea what they do. I'm sure what they do is different from what I do. It's just like being very, separate from everyone.
And yet you're in an urban area. You're in a city. So like right now, I'm recording this from not an urban area. And
You're in
I
Florida,
do know
right?
the people on the
Famously.
block. Yes, famously in Florida. I do know the people on the block after just being here a month.
And how did you get to know them?
Knocking on their door.
You like literally were like, "Hi, I'm James. I just moved in."
There was one time at 1 a.m, the neighbors, it seemed like they were having a party. There was a lot of loud noise. So I said to my wife, Robin, I said, let's go over there. And she said, no, it's 1 a.m. We'll go the next day. And I'm like, no. It's kind of like a Latin culture around here. This is how you do it. We'll just go over and knock on the door. It's 1 a.m. And so we did. And they became good friends. And then they introduced us to their friends. And everybody's very friendly. And I don't know. It's very different from New York City.
There's really nothing preventing me from doing that, right? Like I could do
No,
that.
but people don't do it in cities. I never did it in the city.
Oh, really? Interestingly. So you think it's more of a suburban phenomenon?
I don't know because
Because I don't think they do that in the suburbs very much either.
yeah, I don't know if this is where I'm at is considered a suburb either. I don't know how to define it. It's like a self-enclosed island.
Oh,
So
yeah,
people
maybe
lived
you
here for like
defy
30 or 40
categorization.
years and they're not aimed towards a city.
Yeah. Well, my husband's very into doing the sort of thing that you do. Like he's really into like knowing all the neighbors. And we even had a block party like now it's more than a few years ago, but I remember thinking like, God, I don't want to organize a block party. But I went along. It was a good sport because I'm
And did you enjoy
married.
it?
It was kind of stressful. It was like in the autumn. So it was like this time of year. And this is the time of year for the Harvest Moon Festival. Have you ever heard of this tradition? It's very Asian. So many Asian cultures keep the lunar calendar, not the solar calendar. And so anyway, in this tradition, broadly speaking, like the moon in the autumn can also be like very big and yellow, like a big egg yolk. And so there are all these traditions around like the first full moon at this part of the year. So I decided to not only have a block party, but to have like an autumn moon festival party to acquaint my very non-Asian neighbors with like some element of my cultural heritage. And I had to like make Chinese food for everyone. It was like very stressful actually, but it was okay.
That sounds very stressful. And then did you have to be social on top of that?
Yeah. And, even though I actually just took this personality test because I have this class of undergraduates and I have a rule, which is like anything my undergraduates have to do for homework, I also have to do for homework. So I wanted to teach them about personality and I asked them to like take a personality test. And then of course I had to take it. And I literally got the highest possible score for extroversion. So 5 out of 5. But I don't know whether like somehow this fails to capture the fact that I don't really want to give parties ever. And I don't really enjoy being at them either. Maybe that wasn't on the test.
Let me ask you this. Like if you spend a certain amount of time in a social situation, do you find that you lose energy faster over time or do you gain more energy over time? Like does socializing give you more energy or less energy?
Okay, so I have like a pretty deep answer to this. Like I gave you the tip of the iceberg, which is I can just answer your question. But like personality itself has been debated for like about 60 years. Like what is it really? And so my tip of the iceberg answer is it depends, right? Like, so oftentimes, like after this conversation, I think I'll have more energy. It's a one-on-one conversation. And it has a beginning and an end. Like I know it's an hour. So like it doesn't have this
Oh,
uncertainty.
we're going for more than an hour here.
You're like, you're going to be here all day. You're like, oh, did you not get the email? You're going to be, okay. Parties, I think generally I find them to be energy subtracting. And it's in part because they have no end term, like there's no terminus. And also it's because like the conversations are not always one-on-one and they're not always to me like that interesting. It's like, I really don't like chit chat. So that's my tip of the iceberg answer. There's a lot of the iceberg that's underneath because like this debate about like what it means to have a personality characteristic like grit or extroversion, like has been hotly debated. Like really, it's even called like a war. Sometimes we call it like the war between the situation and the person in psychology. So there's a deeper answer.
So what's the answer there? Like, do people have grit? Because, people have different personalities in different contexts, right? So do people who have grit in their career have grit in family life or or at parties? And is grit related to extroversion or introversion?
Well, grit is not highly related to extroversion or introversion. Like there are gritty introverts and there are gritty extroverts, and they're hardly related at all, actually. It's more related to conscientiousness, right? So people who are gritty tend to be like pretty disciplined and good at regulating their emotion. And they tend to be just like industrious people who are punctual and orderly on average, right? Like it's not a perfect correlation, but there's some. But really, what is personality? So the debate centers on the following. We all have an intuition. Like if you describe to me like Stephen Dubner, or I describe you to my husband, which I did. I can characterize you. I'm like, oh, he's really smart. Like, I could tell it's like his brain like just works fast. So it's sort of like, but it's also kind of goes wherever it wants to. So right, like so
I fooled you. I'm good at fooling people into that.
Well, that would be my appraisal of what you are. So that may not be accurate, but I can make these like more or less sweeping statements, right? Like, oh, so you might describe somebody else to a friend as like, oh, they're very talkative, or like, oh, they're very self-confident. So those are personality characteristics, right? And it makes sense to say that like people have certain personality characteristics. But the war or the debate centered on the following irrefutable fact, which is that if you take the same person who you would say, oh yeah, that's a pretty talkative person, right? Or, this person's pretty gritty. And then you just watch them over like, the 24 hours of their day, the 168 hours of their week. If you look at them over any time period, you see that there's a lot of variability in their behavior. And one of the most important books that was ever written in psychology was published in 1968 by Walter Mischel. He said that if you really look at the data, the consistency of people's behavior across situations is quite low. So he said, like, the correlation between, James's behavior at the, neighborhood party compared to James's behavior, like, at the dinner table, it's maybe a maximum of 0.3, right? Whereas the highest correlation would be 1, and you would expect it to be much closer to 1. And the debate centered on whether we really actually even have such a thing as a personality, or whether there's enormous influence of the situation and that we're basically making mistakes when we say like, oh, this person's gritty or this person is extroverted. So that's the crux of the debate, I think.
So 2 questions. One is, so in general, it's hard to follow someone around 24 hours to see them in different situations. Like you see your coworkers pretty much when you're co-working. You see your tennis club, colleagues when you're playing tennis. But during this pandemic and economic lockdown, we saw people in 2 different situations. One was pre-lockdown, where they had their normal daily lives, and then post-lockdown, where they had kind of this societal stress that everyone had, but also everybody was working differently. They were working remotely. They were dealing with people in different ways. Did you find yourself noticing different people like, oh, I've never seen this side of this person or whatever? Did you see a lot of personality changes?
Yeah, that's an astute observation, right? Because in a way, it was like a natural experiment because you got to see people in 2 very different situations. I think in a way that even though that would have been like the perfect natural experiment, and then maybe I would have been able to observe like big differences in people's behavior. I mean, you could also say like, what is this person like under low stress versus high stress? Like in sports, it's often like called clutch, right? Like there's playing when like the bases are loaded and you have like two strikes, and like it's different than like, oh, you just go to bat and you're the first person in the game. So you could have said that that would have happened in the pandemic. I think one of the challenges in the pandemic is that we're all in this very constrained situation when we're interacting for the most part, right? Which is like we're on like Zoom calls, right? And then the person's got like a 2 square foot like area where they're sitting, and then they're like looking, and when like you can't see their body language, like also everything is pre-scripted when you're on Zoom calls. Like people don't just like randomly get together on Zoom. It's like you have a meeting. So I would say that even though in theory I should have been able to observe a lot of pre-post or pre-mid pandemic differences, it's just like it's really constrained for this other reason.
But I guess like on Twitter, though, it's a little more asynchronous, right? They're not coordinating to be on a Zoom call. They're just getting on Twitter, reading some stuff from the same people they're used to reading from, and then reacting. You could kind of see where there
differences.
Reaction.
I'm sure there are differences that would but I don't need the pandemic, right? Because there are other research studies that have just simply asked, like the same psychologist, Walter Mischel, who really was like one of the greatest psychologists to ever live, and he lived into his 90s. He did this study at a summer camp called Wadiko, and he had this hypothesis after he wrote Personality and Assessment. He thought, let me, study this myself, because really when he wrote that book, it was just a review of all the research that had been done up to like 1968. So he observed of these teenagers at this summer camp, and I think they may have been like at-risk youth, but they displayed aggressive behavior that was different across different situations. And the most important insight that Walter came to, which I think still stands and is really interesting, is that it's not that like, some people are more aggressive, some people are less aggressive. And it's not just that like people tend to be more aggressive when they're around this like mean nurse, and they tend not to be aggressive in the dining hall or what. It wasn't quite that either, because that would have been like, does the person matter? No, the situation matters. It was neither. It's actually a little more complicated, which is that if you take an individual camper, like a young James, right, who's at this camp, that James, if you follow James around for 24 hours, which they essentially did in this study. I mean, they did just like basically follow these kids around like to all their different situations, and then probably with a clipboard, like record, like how aggressive are they right now in this situation, that young James would be like characteristically aggressive in certain of his life situations, but not others. And across time, it was consistent. So it wasn't random. It's like, well, James really doesn't like this nurse. Every time James is around this nurse, he's a pain in the ass. But he's never aggressive around, these 3 friends. But he's sort of in between when he's in the dining hall. It's that there was consistency. He called them these like situation behavior signatures, that like you would sign your name, as it were, like the same every time, but your signature would be different from my signature. So it wasn't just that like, oh, there's personality. And it wasn't just that, oh no, the situation matters more. It was that there were these like person situation interactions, as he put it, but like, it's that we have these signatures, and that's really what the locus of personality is. So when you ask me like, oh, Angela, are you gritty? I think what Walter Mischel might want to say, like, in what circumstances are you consistently gritty? And in what circumstances are you consistently not gritty?
I wonder, though, like the way physics sort of tries to understand things by boiling down to subcomponents. Like in order to understand how materials work, you have to understand how compounds work, you have to understand how atoms work, and so on. I wonder if there is some consistent factor. Instead of trying to measure aggressiveness, which is not consistent, I wonder if someone's feeling of status is consistent, and that leads to different aggression in different contexts.
Yeah, so you anticipated what Walter did next, right? So he came up with this theory of personality, who's like, there's the kind of the overt behavior that you can observe, right? But that's not really what you're interested in. You're interested in the underlying machinery that gives rise to like, why is this kid aggressive with the nurse and not with their friends? Like maybe they're threatened by the nurse, right? So really like what's going on underneath the surface is that this kid is sensitive to authority figures who, threaten their ego or something. I'm just totally making this up.
Mm-hmm.
But he called these like the underlying like cognitive affective, person units. I mean, I'll tell you, it didn't exactly go viral. Like it wasn't, I don't know, it was simple enough for people to like latch onto and then just start repeating. But I do think you're right that like underlying these signatures must be something, right? And as examples of this, you'd be like, say you have a schema, like, a way of understanding the world, like that could be one thing. Say you have a habit, like there must be reasons why we see this consistency in certain situations. And I think that's actually where modern psychology is today, which is to understand, what lies beneath the surface of these behaviors that we can observe.
So, applying it to grit, which you have various ways of understanding it in the book Grit, but let's say it's, a combination of passion and perseverance that forces you through the ups and downs of things you love doing. And I'm going to make this up, but would you say the end goal of grit is some type of success? Or you talk about life satisfaction in the book, but what's the end result of having grit? What's the metric you want?
It's really interesting. I think that when you think of, or when I think of the people who exemplify really long term passion and perseverance, I don't think that they would say that the end goal is happiness, which many philosophers have said, like, it must be the end goal of everything. At least it doesn't come out of their mouths that way. They're not like, oh, I'm doing all this so I can be happy. Which has like an emotional quality, like the very word happy has something about like emotion and positive emotion. And I don't think a lot of these paragons of grit are necessarily happy or like in a positive emotional state, like most of the time, certainly not all the time. I think you could say like, oh, is it achievement? Are they not interested in happiness in life, but are they interested in achievement? I think that's partly right. But I think the most accurate description of the motivational machinery of these people that I really admire and also study is that they have a taste for improvement. Like they have a taste for progress. Like Stephen and I had Gabrielle Hamilton, the chef of Prune in New York City, on our podcast. And, she describes like as soon as she was able to do something, right? Like as soon as brunch was going fine. And then she just ended up kind of being in a kind of like automatic mode of like slicing English muffins and like putting them in the toaster and doing things like to the point where everybody was super happy. She would just set these almost arbitrary goals. Like this time I'm going to get through service, I'm going to do everything, and there can be no crumbs, like, anywhere. Like that, this time I'm going to do it. And then like, I'm going to do it. And there's this taste for progress. Like there's a taste for forward motion. And I don't think that's the same as achievement, because achievement for most people is like a destination. But like Arthur Ashe, the tennis star, among others, said, like it's a journey, not a destination. But I really do think there's something about their mindset, which is like they just always want to be moving forward.
Oh my gosh, I love these clothes. Mizzen and Main. That's Mizzen and Main. It really is the most comfortable work clothes. Travel clothes. I had to travel this whole week. I'm traveling for a week and a half, and I just took Mizzen and Main clothes with me. Close out 2023 in style with comfortable, breathable, packable, and machine washable pieces from Mizzen and Main. As you wrap up your year-end goals, enjoy a Mizzen and Main dress shirt that you can wear confidently. I like that they've very, very just nice, solid colors. I don't really like to get all fancy in patterns and everything, although they do have some pattern shirts, but very comfortable clothes, stretchable pants. It's just super comfortable, but they look professional, and you can wear them casually or professionally. I like some of their flannel shirts or untuck shirts. I love untuck. I never tuck in. So again, whether you're shopping for a special someone or giving yourself the gift you really want, I just buy myself gifts. Mizzen and Main is the perfect gift for any guy who works, travels, and or cares about looking and feeling great. As you could tell by my many photos across the internet, I care about looking fantastic. I'm practically a model. And let's be honest, every guy loves to look great. So again, shop now at mizzenandmain.com and save 20% when you spend $130 or more using promo code James. That's promo code James at Mizzen and Main, Mizzen and Main.com. You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy. The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when it's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like, the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list, because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Bloom, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these Masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a Masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get two memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply. And this is where it intersects a little to we discussed last time, the 10,000 hour rule from Anders Ericsson. Because in order to put in 10,000 hours of deliberate learning, you have to be willing to fail a lot. And you also have to be willing to put in 10,000 hours. give or take, a few
or
thousand
more.
hours.
Most
Yeah.
people, I think, actually are putting in many. 10,000 hours is over a decade usually, right? 3 to 4 hours a day, more or less, you do the math and it's like about 10. But people who are really, really dedicated to what they do often spend, of course, more than a decade doing what they do. So anyway, it can be longer than that.
I wonder if, so obviously, again, having this combination of passion and perseverance, i.e., grit, helps with that deliberate learning because it kind of,
You say deliberate learning, by the way, James. I think it's a really interesting turn of phrase because, of course, Anders always said practice, but like, that must be intentional that you say the words deliberate learning?
well, I sort of feel like practice is not, is the same as doing.
Mm.
So it's just like whether you're doing it or not, I'm not separating out the practice from the doing. So even doing is practice because you still look back on how you did and get feedback, or, what he calls practice, you're still looking back and
Do you
doing the
think
same
these are
thing.
like just interchangeable, or do you have a preference for saying deliberate learning?
I think I have a preference for saying deliberate learning because I'm not so sure. Practice implies some kind of repetition, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And take the case of Gabrielle from Prune, the chef from
Mm-hmm.
Prune. Is it always practice when she says, I'm going to have no crumbs? No, it's more like she's setting an experiment for herself and she's going to learn from it. It's not necessarily the traditional thing like, let's just keep practicing flipping pancakes and we'll get better at it. Practice seems to have more to do with repetition. I suspect learning might happen faster without repetition, but with more experimenting. So the more experiments
Interesting.
she did, she probably learned faster than just simply repeating the same thing over and over.
Okay, so I think this is just a question of connotation, right? So like the word practice to you connotes a kind of like rote repetition without experimentation.
Yeah, like I'm going to practice the scales on the piano.
Yeah, like, well, do it over again, do it over again, do it over again. I think the answer is both, though, because in deliberate practice, as Anders called it, but, I think also in your mental model of deliberate learning, there is repetition. I mean, one of the things about the practice that Anders observed experts do is that I was listening to, I think, like David Chang, and I actually really like his podcast. And he was saying that his favorite recipe was this recipe from some, I don't know, I didn't recognize him, some like great French chef. And the recipe was literally just like make the turbot every day for 6 months, right? And one of the things that experts do is they do repeat. So Julie Andrews has also said this of when she was a young performer, what accelerated her development the most is that when you're on Broadway, you are doing the same thing over and over again. And I think the reason why that is so important, I'm not saying do it mindlessly and not saying that like there's just some magic only in the repetition, but like, when I give a talk, oftentimes, like I'm teaching a class, undergraduate class, and I know immediately after the class, like what I got wrong. Like the timing is wrong. I probably should break this into 2 classes. Like, this assignment didn't work. Okay, this example didn't work, or I needed another example. But the problem is that like I won't be able to repeat this performance for a year, right? Which is the next time I teach this class in this course to another group of students. And what I really need is what Julie Andrews had, which is like, I need repetition. I was like, okay, teach that exact class, but do it tomorrow night and then do it better. Okay, now you know it. So I think that Anders' observation that there is repetition is important, but also you're right, there needs to be experimentation because what you're supposed to do with each rep is to learn and to, in a sort of, sometimes very subtle way, experiment.
Right. So you could see like, oh, what if I had paused more in this part of the talk because people need to absorb something? Or what if I had asked a question into the audience after 10 minutes just to kind of wake them up a little bit out of their cell phones
Yeah,
or
and you
whatever.
need to try it, and then you need to try it again. And that's why you need to make that turbot every night for 6 months, because if you make the turbot and then you switch to chicken and then you decide to make some eggs and then, 6 months later you make another turbot, like you're not going to learn as much. So I do think there's something important about the repetition, but also, that's why he called it deliberate practice. He didn't just say practice. And I think that's one of the big misunderstandings of this work is that people think that if you do anything for 10,000 hours, like a miracle happens and then you're just like really great, but you could just be entirely mediocre. You probably won't be terrible after 10,000 hours, but you likely won't be great unless you do the other things that he talked about.
I don't know, like look at any repetitive kind of sport, like let's say golf. If someone plays golf for 10,000 hours but doesn't have a coach, isn't focused on getting better, just likes going out and playing with their friends, they're really not going to get better after 20 years of playing because they're just going to have their same bad habits. And if anything, they're going to cement those bad habits in because they're not going to get feedback. So in that sense, repetition hurts.
Yeah, he would agree 100%, right? And in fact, in his later writings, Anders would say that definitionally, because I think his idea of deliberate practice evolved. I mean, as it should have, right? But it evolved over the decades of his career and it got sharper and sharper. And one of the things that he spoke a lot about at the end of his research career was that a coach is almost always, I think he would even make it definitional. So, for example, if I were going to just like try to be a better podcast guest or whatever, like, and I just, on my own tried to figure it out and, thought about it, like that would be vastly different than if I were like, James, make me better. Like, let's meet, you can help me, identify goals and then give me feedback. So I think the idea of the intentionality and the support, right? That like, even maybe Roger Bannister didn't fully coach himself to the 4-minute mile, even though that's what he said in his autobiography.
But this is interesting though about the distinction Anders makes between practice and, let's say, learning. I feel with Anders' work, and this is a little different than the end goal of having grit. I feel with Anders' work, it really is about there's a metric of improvement, so you can measure yourself all the time, and it's a very established metric. So in golf, it's your golf score. In memorizing numbers, it's the number of numbers
Digits.
you can memorize.
Yeah.
Whereas, let's say, giving a talk or doing a podcast, yes, there's a notion that one person is better than another, like with giving a talk or to a class, but there's no metric for measuring that. It's just like you feel like at the end of the class, I didn't really do as well as I would have liked. And I don't think Anders, and this is all credit to him, like I love all his stuff, I don't think he responds well to systems without a metric of understanding what improvement is.
No, I mean, I can say this. I mean, unfortunately, he's not
Let's trash him now that he's dead.
able to
No, I
defend
don't mean that.
himself. But I'll tell you this. But look, he was nothing if not honest, right? And he never tired of conversations like these. So I think in a way, Anders would be happy that we're having this conversation. I had a grant that I was so excited about. I decided that this idea of deliberate practice, or as you call it, like deliberate learning, was so common sense and so powerful, and yet totally absent from like anything in K through 12 education. Right? It's not like elementary school looks like deliberate practice or that like professional development for teachers looks like deliberate practice. Like the idea of this intentionality of like repetition with experimentation with like, you have a coach or a mentor, like, it's just totally absent. So got this grant. And I was like, I'm going to introduce deliberate practice into K-12 education. Anders, of course, was like the quarterback on the team, right? He was like there, and I had all these other like a half dozen world-class scientists, and we met every week for at least an hour. And we didn't get anywhere in part because Anders was really insistent that anything that we studied had to have a really clear metric for performance. So it wasn't like golf, right? Like when you have like a 6th grader and you're like, hey, do they know their math better? Like it turns out that like, I was like, okay, well, can't we take their like test scores? And like Anders would be like, yeah, but like, does that meet the criterion? And like, so he had very high standards for what the metric of excellence was. And we never achieved that metric, or we never got to that high watermark. And
Why wouldn't
just
the metric be
disbanded.
grades?
Because grades are subjective, right? So like your teacher gives you a grade, but like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I guess. What about if you limited it to like, math and science and tests that were more objective?
Yeah, I thought that like that would be the solution, right? That you could have standardized tests of mathematics and like, one practical thing was that like students are not taking them. Like, they're not, students take them once a year, right? So you can't really assay this. And then even I think Anders was like, how do we know they're valid, right? I mean, he was nothing if not like an epistemological doubter. So that's why I think when he studied chess players or to some extent musicians, although you could argue that music is like much harder to measure in the quality of them.
Well,
like
he would measure it by the career
yeah,
objective.
do they have a recording contract, et cetera? So, maybe I didn't have enough grit to stick with it, but I wasn't optimistic that we were going to, after like 3 years of working on this project, it's like after 3 years of like weekly video calls and like many emails, I was like, I don't think this is going anywhere. So I ended the project.
Well, okay, so that's going to lead to another question in a second. But the last conversation I had with Anders was about comedy, like where's the relationship between the
That's
10,000 hour rule and getting better at something performance related, like teaching a class or like doing a comedy. And the back and forth was all about the metric. Like, how do you Is it the laughs per minute? Is it the career? Is it, how much money someone's making? It was hard to figure out the metric, and
And you never got past that part of the conversation.
never got past it. And so I was getting really frustrated. So then I started thinking, well, is there a notion of borrowing hours from other industries? So I've done 10,000 hours of public speaking, say, or preparing for
have.
public talks. So can I borrow from those hours? But I couldn't, and I was talking to Maria Konnikova about this in terms of her poker. Like, did her work on her PhD help her? Did she borrow hours from that to be disciplined about studying poker? And so I started thinking in terms of borrowing hours, but then I started thinking more in terms of skipping hours by experimenting. And I think that was more fruitful for me, at least in that domain.
Interesting.
And, chess might be a combination. Like, you practice one set of ideas over and over again. But then also, if you have your own point of view on a particular type of chess position and you're good enough that that point of view is relevant, then experimenting with new points of view is often a way to skip hours. But I called it skipping hours. He might just say that that was a natural outcome of that level of putting in that many hours.
I think he might just say like, oh, you're talking about exactly what I'm talking about, right? Because there has to be this like experimentation. It is also true that I think the more excellent you become at something, these experiments they're quite nuanced. Maybe I'm wrong, but and I'm not saying there's not creativity. And by the way, I do think that like creativity and deliberate practice may be different.
Mm-hmm.
Like many chefs will say, and many athletes even say, like you can deliberate practice like your technique. Like that's where deliberate practice is really helpful. But like the idea for a new dish is like maybe not going to come out of like a deliberate practice process of like these incremental refinements. So I don't want to say that you're wrong if you're saying like, hey, there are limits to this like idea. And I do think creativity is probably the biggest one, right? Like if a comedian is going to come up with new jokes, there's something deliberate practice-y about it. And there's certainly a lot of deliberate practice. And like once you have an idea, refining it, right? But like I don't know that the origin of the new joke is like going to be fully explained by deliberate practice.
Yeah, and so this is why I like the model of grit. So this passion plus perseverance. The perseverance sort of implies there's going to be moments of no happiness, like the opposite of happiness. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to persevere because you persevere because you're unhappy sometimes. Like a chef makes a dish and everyone hates it and they go home thinking, that's it, I'm going to quit being a chef. But then the next morning they wake up and they're like, oh, I can't wait to get back to the restaurant. So that's the passion
I think it's
plus
about a
perseverance.
higher order goal. If you ask the question, like, why? Like, why do they come back? I like think of a few bad days I've had in the last month or two where I'm like, oh, I can't believe I botched it. Like, what was I thinking? Right. And like, I have a higher order goal. If I don't have like, why did I botch that talk? Well, it wasn't like I meant to. But if you ask me like, well, why did you keep trying? Like, why didn't you just like take an easier path afterwards? Like not like, it's because I had a higher order goal. That talk was just so that I could understand a principle better. Right. And that I think the perseverance is from having something that you care about. And actually like, typically it's something that's identity relevant. It's like part of like who you are, like your deepest values. And I think the perseverance comes from realizing that like, it's seeing the bigger picture, right? Like, Viktor Frankl would say, like, as long as you have a why, you can get through like any how or some, I'm botching Frankl. But yeah, I think it's having a higher order goal or purpose that gives meaning and gives you resilience actually, right? Because there's a kind of bouncing back and realizing that like, you can find another path to the same goal.
So let's say you found yourself lacking grit. Like right now, and you talk about this in your book, but this is a particularly important question right now. So many people have lost their jobs, lost their careers, don't know what to do next. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world, so you kind of have nothing to hang your hat on. But you want to find your passion and build perseverance at it and get good at it and change your life for the better. Like, what's a good way now, today, regardless of age? I'm making a very big menu order here.
Yeah, I was like, this is a big one. This is like hard.
But this is the goal of knowing about grit, is that I could then have more of it.
Right. I think to me, grit is, I know this metaphor never works, but I'm just going to say it now. Like it's a phenotype. I guess it doesn't work because unless you understand genotypes, I was a bio major. So I'm like, oh, right. It's like a phenotype as opposed to a genotype. But anyway, it's like what emerges from a person when lots of things are going in a certain way. And because of that, if you ask me like, how does this person get grittier? the answer is always that it depends, right? Like, it depends on what's the reason why they're not gritty, right? Like, I think for some people, but not everyone, it might be because they have a pessimistic, like helpless response to adversity, right? They're just like, well, nothing I can do, right? Okay, but that may not be another person's problem. That other person may be like pretty optimistic, but they just don't have like a disciplined habit of deliberate practice. Like, they never ask for feedback. Like, they don't set clear performance goals of like what they're trying to do. They don't do any repetition or experimentation. Okay, that's a different problem. What if you have somebody who has a lot of discipline, they do a lot of practice, they're pretty resilient, but they don't really have anything that they're interested in the obsessive way, honestly, that I think great stand-up comedians and scientists and investors all have. I mean, there's something about like, when I wake up in the morning, as I often do, like in the middle of the night, like at 4 a.m, my brain is like working on what I was working on yesterday. It's like just cruising along, like, you know what? I actually think that needs to be 2 paragraphs, not 1. And if I were only a 9 to 5 thinker, like, I don't think I would be a very good psychologist. So maybe that's the problem. And they haven't like developed an interest that's deep enough that like they can kind of, not get bored of it. And then there are more problems than that. But I guess the prescription depends on the problem.
Yeah. So, but let's say obsession's important and critical and you're not used to it. Like, let's say you lost the muscle to be obsessive about something because you've been 30 years as a low-level employee somewhere for General Motors, and you stop being obsessive about things.
Yeah, I mean, if you ever were, right? If you were like I don't know. Here's a little reflection I find really useful. I remember some things very well. Like, for example, I think I remember almost everything I've eaten. Or certainly there was a time I was like really interested in food. I thought I might become a chef. And like, I could tell you like every detail of like, oh yeah, and that stir fry only used half an onion. And then like that's something that came easily and without effort. Then there were other things like historical facts, like the number of Supreme Court justices, or like, when the Constitution was like OPEC, like who was in, like, I didn't know any of those things and I couldn't retain them. So if you want to understand your own interests better, one of the things that you could ask yourself are like, what are those things that I find like just stick in my brain without even effort? Like, I remember every detail, like I retain it all. Like, it's not even like I'm trying. And like, what things go right through me, like water through a sieve? And I think that might give you a clue, because in addition to food, I almost never forget anything that I read in psychology. Like, I read it and it's like, yep, it's there. It's in the card catalog, right? And I can remember like, oh yeah, it's on the top right hand of this, I think it was on page 372, like, and I think there was a table, and I think there were like, the variables around that. Like, I remember that. And I think it's because in those moments where I'm reading psychology papers, I am so interested, like the aperture of my mind is open to its fullest radius and everything comes in.
So there's 2 techniques there. There's one is ask yourself, what things can you recall that everyone else says, how did you remember that? That might be a compass to where it's pointing towards what you're interested in. Or try lots of things, keep trying different things until there's something where your memory is like superb on it. Even the next day, you remember every detail.
Yeah, I mean, experimentation. And I know, God, James, something about our conversations, I always feel like, and then they end. And then I have, like, I know this is the end of this conversation. I'll say like, yeah, in addition to just introspecting and thinking like, oh yeah, that's interesting that I seem to pay attention to these things more, seem to remember them more. Experimentation really is key because it is not forecastable, what you will begin to like a lot. And it's not forecastable based on like ex ante first principles. You can't just say to yourself like, well, I like people and, I want to make some money, so maybe I should be in sales. I mean, you can say that to give you the hypothesis that you should be in sales. And then you could test the hypothesis by being in sales. But there's so many trivial aspects of being in sales that are either going to rub you the right way or collectively rub you the wrong way that you have to experiment.
Yeah, I always say you can't think yourself to a passion. You have to do
Try
things.
it, like food.
So we're going to have to do a part 3. Do you mind doing a part 3? Because we haven't even gotten to the perseverance
We
part.
really are going to take 10,000. We're going to do the 10,000 hour interview.
And then quitting, I want to understand a little bit more from the grit point of view. And
yeah, we can do that.
Questions.
Can we do it after my class ends? Because I'm teaching this semester, like 2 classes.
Yeah. When's your class end?
At the beginning of December.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Angela, and have fun. And we'll schedule this. But Jay, let's release these though before that, and then we'll tease the part 3.
Yep.
You have to listen to part 3 to fully understand.
Yeah, it'll be like the trilogy.
Yes, exactly.
Entresto, sacubitril valsartan tablets, is the #1 heart failure brand prescribed by cardiologists and has helped over 1 million people with heart failure. It's a prescription medicine that treats adults with long-lasting chronic heart failure and works better when the heart cannot pump a normal amount of blood to the body.
Don't take Entresto if pregnant. It can cause harm or death to an unborn baby. Don't take Entresto with an ACE inhibitor or aliskiren, or if you've had angioedema with an ACE or ARB. Don't take with aliskiren or within 36 hours of taking an ACE inhibitor. The most serious side effects are angioedema, low blood pressure, kidney problems, or high blood potassium. Angioedema is swelling of your face, lips, tongue, and throat that may cause death. If it causes difficulty breathing, get emergency help.
Ask your doctor about Entresto. To learn more, visit support.entresto.com or call 833-446-6699. For pricing, visit Entresto.com/cost. If you can't afford your medication, Novartis may be able to help.